If someone had told me at 77 that I'd spend 2 months in a nursing home, I would have laughed loudly. That wasn't supposed to be part of my story. Not me, not ever. But life has a way of humbling us and teaching us, often when we least expect it. What began as a short recovery stay became one of the most eye-opening chapters of my entire life. Behind those quiet hallways and shared meals, I discovered truths I wish I'd known decades ago. These aren't just lessons for the elderly. They're reminders for everyone about what we overlook, what we hold on to, and what we sometimes forget to cherish until it's gone. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you 7 life-changing truths that came from that time. And it all began on my very first day, with the hardest, most painful realization of all. Loneliness is the worst disease of old age. What if the worst illness in old age isn't physical but emotional? When I first arrived at Oakhaven Senior Living at 77, I believed I was just there for physical recovery. 2 months, maybe less, then back to my regular life. I packed light, kept my planner nearby, and reassured my daughter over the phone. I'll be out before the tomatoes ripen. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The halls weren't unfriendly, just sterile. The meals weren't bad, just bland. But the silence? That was deafening, not the absence of sound, but of connection. You could hear laughter from the TV in the common room, the shuffle of carts down tiled floors, even the occasional bingo call. But emotionally, the air was still, empty. On my 3rd morning, I noticed Irene, always dressed in pastel blouses and pearls, sitting by the door. She watched the entrance every day, until lunch, then quietly returned to her room. A nurse later whispered, "She gets ready every morning, just in case her son visits." He hadn't come in over 9 months. A few doors down, I met Joe, a former aerospace engineer who once led major NASA projects. He showed me yellowed photos of rockets, teams in lab coats, his eyes lighting up with pride. "Built to connect worlds," he said, grinning. But in the last year, none of his children had flown in to see him. These weren't isolated stories. They were everywhere. Despite well-meaning staff and scheduled care, I started to see what wasn't on the clipboard, the quiet heartbreak of being forgotten. It wasn't just about missing visitors. It was about feeling invisible in a world that once needed you. The Surgeon General recently declared loneliness a national epidemic. Among seniors, it's linked to a 29% higher risk of heart disease, a 32% increased risk of stroke, and even cognitive decline. In fact, chronic loneliness is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I felt it too. As the days passed, I found myself wondering if I didn't call first. Would anyone reach out? Would anyone notice if I disappeared into the rhythm of hallway checks and meal trays? Then came Margaret, an 88-year-old retired school principal. We started playing checkers every Friday. One afternoon, she leaned in and said, "It's not the arthritis that hurts most. It's feeling like the world kept going without me." That moment broke something open in me. Loneliness doesn't always wear a sad face. Sometimes it's dressed up in lipstick and pearls, smiling politely by the entrance. But it eats at us quietly, dangerously from the inside out. The good news? Connection doesn't require grand gestures. A phone call, a letter, a shared crossword puzzle. Human contact is the only medicine we all need, and one that costs nothing but a moment of intention. In the next part, I'll tell you what Richard, the wealthiest man at Oakhaven, taught me about health, value, and what money can't fix. But for now, I want to ask you, who in your life might be waiting quietly by a door, hoping to be remembered? What's the point of building a fortune if you no longer have the strength to lift a fork? That question struck me one Thursday evening as I watched Raymond, once a real estate mogul with holdings in 4 states, tremble while trying to spoon up a bit of chicken noodle soup. He was 82, sharply dressed as always in a crisp button-down shirt, but his hand wouldn't stop shaking. After a few unsuccessful attempts, he chuckled to himself, embarrassed. "I used to own 3 homes," he said, "but now I can't even open a bottle of water." Raymond wasn't bitter, just clear-eyed, the kind of clarity you get when life strips away distractions. Behind him hung photos of his younger years, champagne on yachts, ribbon cuttings at high-rise buildings, golf at Pebble Beach. They all looked like trophies, but trophies gather dust. Muscles, when unused, do more than that. They fade. I began to notice how many of us in the facility had once lived lives of ambition, hustle, and relentless productivity. Some were former CEOs, professors, entrepreneurs, but in here, the currency had changed. It wasn't about influence or wealth. It was about mobility, memory, and meaning. The data is sobering. According to the National Institute on Aging, 1 in 4 Americans over 65 experiences some form of disability. Nearly 30% of adults over 60 suffer from sarcopenia, a condition of severe muscle loss that dramatically affects balance and independence. And the majority of that decline, it's preventable. You don't need to run marathons in your 70s, but you don't need to move. Regular walking, even just 20 minutes a day, can reduce your risk of heart disease, stroke, and cognitive decline. Resistance training helps retain strength. Stretching improves flexibility. None of this requires expensive equipment, just consistent care. But there's more to health than what shows up on a lab test. I met Nora, 79, a retired librarian, who looked strong for her age but rarely left her room. "I just don't see the point anymore," she told me, her voice flat. That's when I realized health without purpose isn't health, it's maintenance. The most vibrant residents weren't the most mobile or the youngest. They were the ones who still engaged. Evelyn ran a morning poetry circle. Ken helped staff decorate for every holiday. Dorothy read to children over Zoom every Tuesday. They moved their bodies and exercised their hearts. And me? I started small. I walked laps around the garden. I began writing again. I even joined Evelyn's poetry group. Funny how a haiku can do more for your blood pressure than a pill sometimes. So here's what I learned, and what Raymond reminded me of that evening. You can't buy back time, and you can't outsource your health. In the next chapter, I'll talk about a word many of us struggle to say out loud, even when we desperately need to: help. But first, let me ask you this. What's one thing you're doing today that your future body or mind will thank you for? Who are we when the things we once did effortlessly suddenly require help? It happened on a rainy morning at Pine Brook Assisted Living. I stood in front of the mirror, trying to button my shirt. My fingers, usually nimble, were stiff, uncooperative. I fumbled, sighed, and tried again and again. After several minutes, I gave up, staring at my half-buttoned reflection with a quiet, unfamiliar ache in my chest. It wasn't just frustration, it was identity loss. That small act, so simple, so human, had been mine for over 7 decades. And now, I needed help. Those 3 words, I need help, are among the hardest for many of us to say, especially in a country that prizes independence as a badge of honor, and especially after a lifetime of being the one others depended on. But here's what I saw in that facility. Everyone needs help eventually, and how we receive that help often shapes our aging experience more than the help itself. Take Shirley, a retired gym teacher who refused to use a walker even after 2 falls. "If I start using that thing, I'm admitting defeat," she said, jaw clenched. But her resistance came at a cost: limited mobility, and more importantly, isolation. Then there was Thomas, 85, once a trial lawyer, now navigating Parkinson's. He accepted help not with shame, but grace. "All my life, I stood up for others," he told me. "Now I let others stand up for me." Watching him laugh with the staff as they assisted him showed me something I'd never seen before. Strength isn't just about what we do alone. It's about how we let others care for us with dignity. The Centers for Disease Control reports that falls are the leading cause of injury-related death among Americans aged 65 and older. Most of those falls happen at home, doing simple things like getting out of bed, reaching for a shelf, or yes, buttoning a shirt. So why do we wait until after a crisis to accept support? We live in homes designed for youth stairs, slippery tubs, hard-to-reach cabinets. Aging in place is possible, but only if we start adapting before we need to. Grab bars, lever handles, nightlights, these aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of wisdom. Technology helps too. I met Edna, 82, who manages her medication, grocery orders, and weekly book club entirely through her tablet. "Alexa's my assistant," she laughed, "and my emergency backup. But even more than tools and tech, what matters is mindset. True independence isn't about doing everything by yourself. It's about retaining the freedom to make choices, even when those choices include asking for help. And Accepting support doesn't mean surrendering control. It means preserving quality of life. The most content residents at Pinebrook weren't clinging to the past. They were reimagining independence not as self-reliance, but as the freedom to still direct their lives. In the next section, we'll talk about the surprising way your relationship with stuff changes as you age, and why that might be the key to peace of mind. But for now, I invite you to reflect. Is your desire to stay independent helping you, or quietly holding you back? What would your life look like if you had to fit it into one room? That was the question staring back at me as I sat on a cold plastic chair in my garage, surrounded by decades of belongings. Boxes labeled Christmas decorations, Mum's china, old tax files, and just in case memories towered around me like monuments to a life once lived at full speed. I had to downsize from a 4-bedroom home to a single 12 by 14-foot room at Greenfield Senior Residence. It was like being asked to choose which parts of my story were worth saving and which parts to erase. I cried more that day than I had in years, not from sadness exactly, but from the weight of deciding. The antique table where my kids learned to carve pumpkins, my late wife's recipe box with her handwriting fading, a stack of birthday cards from people long gone. These weren't just items, they were timestamps, proof that I'd been here, that I'd mattered. But space is unforgiving, and so, with a heavy heart, I let most of it go. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice something. The residents who seemed the most at peace weren't the ones with the nicest rooms or the most stuff. They were the ones who had chosen meaning over volume. Elaine, across the hall, kept only 3 things on her shelf: a wedding photo from 1956, her grandson's handprint in clay, and a worn-out Bible passed down from her mother. Everything else, she told me, just takes up space. And then there was Marvin, a former postal worker who brought a scrapbook of handwritten notes from neighbors he'd served for over 40 years. "These are worth more than a Lexus," he said with a grin. "Every page has a name, a moment." Those choices taught me that what we keep often reveals who we are, and what we let go of reveals what we've learned. A recent study from UCLA's Center on Everyday Lives of Families found that the average American home contains over 300 items. And yet, studies consistently show that clutter increases stress, disrupts sleep, and even elevates cortisol levels. Letting go isn't just practical, it's emotional wellness. Now I try to live by a new rule. If it doesn't serve a purpose or tell a meaningful story, it doesn't stay. I call it living lighter, not just in terms of stuff, but in spirit. Of course, not everything is easy to part with. I still keep the pocket knife my father gave me, and one letter from my daughter I've read at least 50 times. But I've learned that the fewer things I own, the more space I create for connection, for presence, for peace. In the next section, I'll introduce you to Ruth, whose happiness wasn't in her past treasures, but in the sunrise she watched every morning. But before we get there, take a moment to ask yourself, if your life had to fit into one room, what would you keep and why? When was the last time you noticed something small and truly felt joy from it? At Silver Pines Assisted Living, there was a woman named Ruth who became a kind of quiet legend on our floor. Every morning by 6:30 a.m., she was parked in her wheelchair near the east-facing window at the end of the hall, head slightly tilted, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed just enough to soak in the light. This sunshine, she once told me with a smile, cost nothing, and yet it's better than anything hanging in a museum. Ruth had severe arthritis and needed help with nearly everything, but she radiated peace, not because her life was perfect, but because she had trained her heart to find joy in what was still within reach. And the truth is, she wasn't the only one. Every Thursday, when a scruffy golden retriever named Max visited for pet therapy, even the grumpiest residents softened. You'd hear laughter echoing down the hallway, like we were back in high school. One woman named Gloria, who barely spoke the rest of the week, would light up as soon as Max sat beside her. Then there was Arthur, who kept a bird feeder outside his window. "They're more interesting than any TV show," he'd tell me. He had names for all of them: Frank, the blue jay, Darla, the bossy cardinal, and Thelma and Louise, 2 chickadees who always arrived together. These were people who had lost much, but somehow, they still knew how to notice beauty when it appeared. Not in grand adventures, but in the exquisite ordinary: a soft blanket, a warm cup of tea, the sound of a piano echoing from the activity room on Fridays. Science backs this up. An 80-year longitudinal Harvard study found that simple moments of connection and contentment, not wealth, titles, or even good genes, were the most consistent predictors of long-term happiness and health. The same holds true as we age. Joy becomes less about the extraordinary and more about the intentional. At Silver Pines, I started writing down 3 small things each day that brought me comfort. The first sip of coffee, a neighbor's wave, the scent of rain on pavement. Slowly, I noticed more and needed less. I once believed happiness had to be earned or achieved, that it was found in vacations or milestones. But the truth is, it often hides in plain sight. The trick is remembering to look. In the next chapter, I'll introduce you to 2 residents who taught me one of life's hardest and most liberating truths, that peace sometimes comes not from getting something back, but from letting something go. But for now, pause with me and ask yourself, what's one small, ordinary thing in your life today that quietly brings you joy? What pain are you still carrying that no one else can see? At Brookview Retirement Center, I met 2 people whose lives taught me everything I now understand about forgiveness. The first was Harold, 91, a former insurance executive who sat by himself most days in the solarium. His posture was proud, but his eyes were hard. During one of our conversations, he told me, "My daughter chose her husband over me 20 years ago. I haven't spoken to her since. She stopped being my family the day she walked out." He repeated that same sentence to anyone who asked. Like a wound, he refused to let heal. 2 doors down lived Edna, 89. Her son had been killed by a drunk driver when he was just 24. When I asked how she coped, she replied quietly, "I forgave him, not because I excused what he did, but because I couldn't carry that much pain forever." Edna spent her days making quilts for children's hospitals and organizing birthday cards for residents who had no family. Her room was always filled with color, warmth, and laughter. Harold's room, by contrast, was pristine, immaculate, and completely silent. Their stories haunted me not because of what happened to them, but because of how differently they chose to live afterward. Research from Johns Hopkins shows that forgiveness reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, improves immune response, and even lessens the risk of depression. And it's not just spiritual, it's biological. Holding on to anger literally hurts us. One afternoon, a hospice chaplain shared an exercise that helped me more than I expected. Write the name of someone who hurt you, what they did, how it made you feel, and then say aloud, "I release this for my peace." Tear the paper, burn it, whatever works. The act isn't magic, but the decision is. I tried it with an old betrayal I'd clung to for years. The tears came fast, but something else followed. Lightness. Not joy, not resolution, just the quiet relief of no longer dragging an old chain behind me. Forgiveness isn't a gift we give to the person who wronged us. It's a gift we give to ourselves to stop the bleeding, to reclaim our peace. Harold never got there. He passed away, still holding on to the bitterness that had kept him company for 2 decades. His daughter didn't attend the memorial. Edna, on the other hand, read a poem that day. "Forgiveness," she said, "is how I keep from disappearing into grief." In the next section, I'll tell you about Arthur, a man who taught me that some of the most profound goodbyes come wrapped in ordinary days. But before you go, consider this. Is there someone you need to forgive, not for them, but for yourself? If today were your last, would you be proud of how you're spending it? That question came alive for me on a Wednesday morning at Willow Creek Retirement Community. The night before, I had dinner with Arthur, a 79-year-old retired literature professor with a sharp wit and a deep love for poetry. He was quoting Shakespeare between bites of peach cobbler and making the table laugh with his impression of a pompous theatre critic. That night, he told me, "Every day's a page. You just never know which one ends the chapter." The next morning, his chair was empty. Arthur passed away in his sleep, quietly and without warning. Just hours after reciting sonnets and debating Hemingway, he was gone. At Willow Creek, death isn't abstract. It's not a far-off idea. It's the empty seat at breakfast, the bed that no longer needs to be made, the silence where a voice used to be. What shook me most wasn't the sadness, it was the ordinariness of his last day. There was no dramatic farewell, no bucket list finale, just another evening full of stories, laughter, and warm dessert. And that, perhaps, is the point. So many of us live like we're guaranteed decades. We say someday like it's a promise. Someday I'll visit. Someday I'll apologize. Someday I'll start writing that book or take that trip. But the truth is, someday isn't on the calendar. Only today is. During my stay, I heard that phrase often. One day I'll call my grandson. One day, I'll make peace with my sister. One day I'll finally tell my story. But time slipped past so many of them before one day could arrive. Since leaving Willow Creek, I've tried to live by a new question. If this is my last day, am I honoring it? Not in a fearful way, but in a focused way. Because the ordinary becomes sacred when we see it for what it really is, a moment we may never get back. This shift doesn't require grand gestures. It's about small acts of presence, turning off the background noise to listen fully, making that call, saying what we truly mean, holding someone's hand without rushing to the next thing. The residents who passed with peace weren't necessarily the most accomplished. They were the ones who loved openly, forgave freely, and stayed awake to their lives until the very end. And so, before we part ways, I ask you this: what are you putting off for someday that deserves your attention today? What if the wisdom we spend a lifetime chasing was never out there but always within reach? When I first walked through the doors of Willow Creek, I thought I was leaving something behind: independence, freedom, maybe even relevance. But those sterile hallways and shared dining rooms became the backdrop to one of the most profound awakenings of my life. I didn't lose something there. I found clarity, not in the way textbooks teach or doctors prescribe, but in conversation, in quiet observation, in the echo of voices that didn't know they were teaching me anything at all. Wisdom wore lipstick. It limped down the hallway. It sat quietly in a rocking chair, humming old hymns. In just 2 months, I came face to face with the truths we often avoid until it's too late. That loneliness can be more damaging than illness. That health is a gift, not a guarantee. That true independence includes knowing when to receive. That memories matter far more than the things we collect. That simple joys are life's greatest luxury. That forgiveness frees the giver most. And that every ordinary day is, in fact, extraordinary. I arrived with a suitcase and a plan. I left with a notebook filled with names, quotes, and memories. But more importantly, I left with a softer heart and a sharper sense of what really matters. Life is not measured in years or titles. It's measured in moments of presence, in the depth of our relationships, and in the courage it takes to live with intention. So now, each morning, I ask myself, will today be something I remember or something I regret not living fully? You don't have to wait until you're 77 and in a nursing home to ask that question. You can ask it now. And if the answer isn't what you hoped, it's never too late to choose differently. We don't control the length of our lives, but we do have some say in the depth. And maybe that's enough. Which of these 7 truths spoke to you most deeply, and what will you do with it today?